Hello, and welcome to our lecture on cross cultural contact and the arrival of Europeans in North America in the early 17th century. I want to talk to you today very briefly about some of the issues that you will hear or read about in Chapter 1 of our Zen textbook. So, today I want to talk about Columbus, um, the Indians, and human progress. So, there are a couple of things I want to start off with just to give us an idea of sort of the differences between college history and high school history. And one is textbooks. In high school textbooks, there's sort of this myth of human progress, that things improve over time in a way that often is problematic for us later as we really start to look at human development. So I want you to really start to consider what you think progress means, particularly when we think about human progress over history. The other thing I want you to think about as we talk about progress is historical empathy. At the end of this lecture, I'm going to remind you about an extra credit assignment regarding historical empathy and how you can begin to apply it within your understanding of American history. All right, but as I'm saying, particularly in this moment where I don't know how much you've been paying attention to the sort of discussion over public history and the display of monuments going on across the country. But in places like Boston, I know statues of Christopher Columbus have come down, right? And of course, depending on what version of history one learned, um, you get very different interpretations of Christopher Columbus. There was a very sanitized version of Columbus that children began to learn in America, in public education at least, of him discovering America, blah, blah, blah. Sorry. And that really obscures the truth, right? So when there is a public reckoning on Columbus and the need to take down the statue, but even beyond that, right? Just think how many cities, towns, places are named after Columbus around the United States. I mean, it's mind numbing. So, what happens when people start to unpack, really investigate who the people are that things are named after, right? It can lead to fundamental, interesting changes. So, when it comes to Columbus, what Zen wants us to know, and what I also want you to know, is that it's not as if Columbus' arrival, something happened to where over time he started to figure out ways he could exploit indigenous people. That was there from the jump. And Zen does a very good job of explaining this. He gives us this quotation. Columbus writes this in his own journals. They would make fine service talking about the Arawak. With 50 men, we could subjugate them and make them do whatever we want, right? So this is upon the early meeting of the Arawak people and their arrival in the Caribbean in the late 1490s. And of course, indigenous people are all over the Americas with very complex civilizations, societies, religions, ideas about warfare, ideas about justice and law. But it really magnifies this clash of worldviews between what old world values are and what the values are of indigenous peoples in North America. What does this attitude lead to, like Columbus? Well, on his second expedition, so he arrives, he meets the Arawak people, who he also tries to fool by using his knowledge of an eclipse coming to demonstrate he has godly powers, right? He does that too. And then upon his second expedition, he wants gold and slaves. So sends 17 ships, around 1,200 crew members to take people and goods. And this resulted in real clear realities now for the Arawak, who have to deal with what happens when women and children are taken, where husbands, fathers, sons are murdered. Um, People are forced to work to death, where they're also exposed now to all these invisible germs coming off of Europeans. Um, what I also think is quite striking, right, is that Columbus and the crew round up 1,500 Arawak men, women, and children, picked out 500 of the best specimens to load onto ships. So, within these earliest examples of encounters, we find this very brutal exchange, an exchange that will have hundreds of years of implications. All right. As I mentioned before, North America has millions of indigenous peoples that are organized into bands, what we will eventually call tribes, although that's also a Eurocentric word. Most of these people are semi-agricultural, meaning that they do grow some food and are a little nomadic. There were large-scale civilizations throughout Mexico, obviously, but these people have different ideas about religion, different languages, but they're also somewhat in communication with each other, right? There are extensive trade networks that are already developing across the continent, basically. So, although some are isolated, some are very much aware of each other. In the Great Lakes region, North America, so around here, for instance, we know that the Iroquois League, or a collection of different bands or linguistically related people, they very much get together to form a sort of a unit of or a larger system of interaction. This happens either around 1142 or 1451, as the dates sort of change depending on the source you look at. Amongst what they refer to as the Six Nations of people, no crime, no police, is a time of peace amongst people. And I think this is really interesting, because this is one of those very striking differences between indigenous people, and particularly the British, who are coming to colonize North America, is that indigenous children are often taught to be highly independent, to question authority, to ask questions, to find things out for themselves, to do things for themselves, to have free range to roam. Puritan children will not, right? Puritan children, British children will be taught to respect authority, don't talk back, don't ask questions, don't talk to adults, don't roam free, don't think for yourself. So you have a very different understanding of childhood. And I think that's very telling of the types of societies that are clashing here. What happens then where these Iroquois people then come in contact with Europeans, right? Well, in the context of the British, who are establishing colonies beginning in the 1600s along the Atlantic seaboard in a place like Maryland, you have a number of children who are prosecuted under British law for talking back, for challenging authority, right? We start to see those cases emerge. So there starts to be a real world impact of policing of children based on very different values. And if you think that doesn't apply now, or rather, I think that's a very interesting thing to start to see even now. Okay. So one of the indigenous peoples who are first impacted by British arrival are the Powhatan. And they're located along the Atlantic seaboard, specifically in places like Virginia and parts of Maryland. The Powhatan are the ancestral band of people that Pocahontas belongs to. And again, as you've already talked about, she's a young woman serving as translator, obviously in some ways serving as the emissary or the bridge that can be created between the British and the Powhatan people. And she's given basically to please. Oh, sorry. Let me fix that. To please John Smith. Um, Violence will become a regular part of interaction between the Powhatan and the British colonists who are starting to arrive in Jamestown and Roanoke and other colonies around Virginia. Um, and this violence is going to escalate. It is going to create a pivotal moment in 1622, right? Now, this is interesting because the first African slaves arrive, 1619? The British arrive around 1607. So by the time of the Powhatan, quote unquote, massacre of Jamestown, there are already African slaves along with British colonists. Powhatan, and I bring this up because, right, one of the few who survives the Powhatan massacre. And again, this is where the Powhatan people go into the village, sort of the township of Virginia, and slaughter people because of a previous British attack on them. And Anthony Johnson, who will become a African enslaved man who will become free during this time period. And we know a lot about him because of court records. And he will eventually become his own plantation owner, owning both other enslaved Africans as well as indentured servants. So I just want to, hold on, show you this very quickly. And you could see some images of Powhatan, the chief of Powhatan, talking about peace and war, talking about the arrival of smallpox, and what happens when Native peoples use the blankets of the British. There are a number of really interesting primary sources here, but I think this is telling. So this is Chief Powhatan, and he writes to John Smith saying this: I have seen 2 generations of my people die. I know the difference between peace and war better than any man in my country. I am now grown old and must die. My authority must descend to my brothers, then to my sisters and my 2 daughters, which of course is interesting because women had much more power and indigenous cultures than they do in European cultures. But he goes on to ask, why are you destroying us? Are you jealous of us? We are unarmed. We're willing to give what you ask for. Why do you come here? Why do you kill us? And this is really just a sort of striking account of how this interaction is going, and the sort of confusion that's going on amongst indigenous people about what these British colonists actually want from them. Another example of an indigenous community are the Pequods, who are living along the coast of Rhode Island. They are also going, to be very much affected by the arrival of the Puritans, right? These are your pilgrims. Calling them pilgrims is a hell of a lot nicer than calling them for what they really are, which are Puritans, right? Puritans is a form of Protestant Christianity that's highly rigid, that is sort of steeped in superstition and the belief in surveillance. And quite frankly, no one in England really wants to live by them, or anyone in Western Europe. And they do find themselves making this treacherous journey across the Atlantic to colonize what will be Massachusetts, Plymouth Rock. And there's a very uneasy alliance that's going on between the Puritans and the Pequots, who are living along the coastline. You certainly see massacres happening on both sides. There are numerous references in terms of Puritans talking about getting rid of the indigenous, burning them. There are numerous smallpox epidemics, outbreaks that are just killing hundreds of Pequots around, as well as millions of indigenous across North and South America. And it's interesting because in terms of smallpox, some of the people who are not getting sick in North America are Africans. So why is this? Well, Africans had developed vaccines against smallpox. They had been doing this for hundreds of years. So Cotton, I want to say it's Cotton Mather, it's one of those famous Mathers in Puritan history, learns from an enslaved African about inoculating for smallpox and actually will be quite successful. So there's a great deal to unpack here in terms of these cross cultural encounters, but it's a good demonstration, right, of how all of so many things are merging to create these conditions of conflict, including ideas about science, religion, race, um, freedom, sort of colliding in North America. All right, very quickly, also the Cherokee. The Cherokee are going to be one of the largest groups in North America, occupying a space in North Georgia and across the Carolinas. They also practice oral history, had a very intense sort of cosmology explaining their origin myth, where they come from, and how they develop as a people. Some of the earliest written encounters from a European perspective between the British and the Cherokee come from Hernando de Soto, who arrives in the Southeast around the 1500s. The British, however, arrived to Georgia around the 1750s. So there's already been a 150-year presence, approximately, of the British in North America. But colonizing Virginia, parts of Maryland, obviously, the Carolinas. But Georgia's different. Georgia's not founded officially until the 1750s. And, right, this is also something to think about. Georgia will be established as a non-slave holding colony. Now, I know that is shocking news for many. But interestingly enough, Georgia was originally designed to be a non-slave holding colony, as determined by its founders, Oglethorpe, who did not believe in enslavement and saw Georgia as being different from the colonies of Carolina. So we'll have to ask ourselves, what happened between the 1750s and then the early 1800s, where Georgia obviously, right, has become entrenched in enslavement. So we will talk about that as well. All right. As I talked about a little bit in the last lecture, Indigenous women, their lives are drastically changed by Europeans. Children, the lives of children of the Indigenous are they're patrolled now from the British, colonized in ways that they could not imagine. The gender parallelism that had existed in Indigenous communities, meaning women did have power, they are not they're not necessarily equal to men, but there are sort of shared governances and the belief that women do have lots of power that you really do not see operating in British society at the same time. Women, you have sort of two things going on. You have Indigenous women who are being raped, who are also sort of being kidnapped and taken as sort of sex concubines, if you will, by European men. And at the same time, you have white women who are being kidnapped as well, who, upon returning to British culture, even in the colonies, are sort of straddling between two worlds, who were sort of never really allowed back in, thinking that they've had some transformative change because they've touched something sort of wild or quote unquote savage or primal. So, I'm really interested in those intersections of history where you see this connection between race and gender and class and these captivity narratives, right? What happens to white women versus the sort of bigger issue of rape in the Indigenous, and for Black women is sort of left silent. So we will continue to sort of explore these gender issues as we go forward. All right. So as you think about the origins of America, right, it has a history of sort of violent clashes. exploitation, rape, theft of indigenous land. If we look at Columbus's first writings, his intentions are very clear about what he intends to do. So if that's our origin, it should really give us pause for what is to come. All right. For the indigenous people, again, with the arrival, is going to change their entire lives from suffering this epidemic that's going to go on in terms of smallpox to dwindling numbers to dwindling access to resources. Their lives are going to change by this arrival of Europeans who, again, are coming from every side. And we see this very much, mostly through these lived lives of women. All right, so that's all for today. We will meet back to discuss next week's topic. Right. So if you're listening closely and want some extra credit, I will need you to go now to the extra credit module, to go to our module, look at this week, click on extra credit, and tell me how you can apply historical empathy to the topic of cross-cultural contact. Great. I look forward to seeing what you write.